They laughed when she carried the bark inside. Not one bundle. Not two. Armload after armload of pale birch sheets stripped in wide curls from deadfall trunks and stacked beside the cabin wall like oversized paper. From the road below, men slowed their wagons to stare. Women paused at the well. Children followed her halfway up the slope just to see what strange thing she was doing now. Mara Ellison ignored them all. She shouldered another bundle through the doorway and laid it beside the growing pile. The cabin itself was nothing special. One room, rough-hewn logs, stone chimney, a roof that held if the snow stayed honest. It had belonged to an old trapper who died 2 winters earlier, and most folks thought Mara had overpaid for it simply because no one else wanted a lonely place on the ridge. But Mara hadn't bought the cabin for what it was. She bought it for where it stood, high enough to catch sun, far enough from the creek fog, sheltered by spruce on the north side, and with a floor she knew was raw the moment she stepped inside. Planks laid straight over joists with open air beneath. Pretty enough in summer, deadly in winter. Cold rises into a house the way smoke escapes one. Most people never understood that until their feet stopped feeling anything. Mara did. That was why the bark mattered. She knelt near the doorway and pried up the first loose floorboard. Dust rose in the shaft of afternoon light. Beneath it, darkness and empty crawl space. She slid one hand into the gap. Cold, even in autumn. Good, she thought grimly. Better to fix it now. Bootsteps sounded outside. Heavy, certain. Jonas Hale didn't bother knocking. He leaned in the doorway with 2 men behind him, all 3 grinning like boys arriving at a show. Heard you were hauling half the forest indoors, Jonas said. Mara kept working. Only the useful half. The men chuckled. Jonas looked at the stacks of bark, then at the lifted boards. You lining your walls with paper now? Floor. That got louder laughter. He stepped inside and nudged a bark sheet with his boot. It was thick, layered naturally in curls, silver white outside and reddish brown within. This, he said, you're putting this under your feet? I'm putting it under the boards. Jonas blinked, then laughed again. Woman, bark belongs in the stove. Not birch. She finally stood and faced him. Birch bark sheds moisture, holds trapped air between layers, doesn't rot quickly, doesn't compress flat if laid right. Jonas stared for a second, then shook his head. You always got a reason for odd things. I prefer reasons to habits. The 2 men behind him barked laughter at that. Jonas spread his arms. Everyone else uses rugs. Rugs warm the top of the board, Mara said. I'm warming what's beneath it. He smirked. And you expect a little bark to beat winter? I expect understanding to beat guessing. That silenced him just long enough to annoy him. He tipped his hat and stepped back. Well, when you get tired of sleeping on kindling, valleys still got room. The men laughed all the way down the slope. Mara listened until the sound faded. Then she went back to work. She lifted every board, one by one. Between the joists she packed dry birch bark in overlapping layers, curved side downward so moisture would shed away. Where gaps were wide, she added straw between bark sheets. Where drafts entered near the corners, she sealed cracks with clay and moss. By sunset, half the floor was done. By moonrise, all of it. She relayed the planks tightly, hammered them down, then stood in the middle of the room breathing hard. The cabin looked exactly the same. That was the kind of improvement people mocked most. The kind they couldn't see. That night the temperature dropped hard. Mara woke before dawn and placed her bare feet on the floorboards. Cool, but not biting. She smiled. 2 days later, frost silvered the ridge grass. In the valley below, smoke rose early from chimneys. Mara walked barefoot across the cabin to stir her stove. Still cool wood. Still no bite. Heat from the fire no longer vanished downward the way it had before. It lingered in the room, trapped above an insulated floor instead of feeding the emptiness below. She used less wood. That pleased her most. By the end of the week, everyone knew about the bark floor. Because Jonas made sure of it. She stuffed her house with tree skin. She says the floor is smarter now. She'll be planting roots in the table next. The jokes traveled faster than wagons. Mara let them. People often defended their ignorance with laughter. Then the wind changed. It came sharp from the north, slicing through the spruce line with a tone Mara did not like. Not the playful moan of ordinary weather. A steadier sound. Colder. Hungry. She checked her woodpile. Enough for 2 weeks, if careful. One of foolish. She checked the chimney draw. Good. She checked the floor seams. Tight. Down in the valley, men called it an early snap and drank longer than usual. That night, the first real freeze arrived. Water buckets glazed thick before midnight. Doors swelled shut. Animals kicked nervously in barns. Mara sat by a modest fire and watched how evenly the cabin held warmth. No icy current creeping up through the boards. No cold pooling around her ankles. The floor stayed neutral, which in winter was a kind of miracle. Morning came iron gray. By afternoon, snow began. By evening, the storm found its teeth. Wind drove powder through every weakness in the valley. Cabins with raised floors turned cruel first. Cold climbed through boards while heat fled upward. Families piled blankets over their legs and kept feeding fires that never seemed to win. Mara heard the storm hammering her walls, but felt none of it beneath her feet. She laid another log on the fire. Just one. Enough. At midnight, pounding hit her door. Not wind. Fists. She opened it to a swirl of snow and a face she expected. Jonas Hale stood there, beard iced white, eyes wide with something he'd never worn before. Humility. Our floor's frozen through, he said hoarsely. Children can't stand on it. Fire won't catch up. His gaze dropped past her shoulder to the inside of the cabin. To Mara standing in stockings on bare floorboards. Warm floorboards. He looked back at her slowly. The bark, he said. Then the wind shoved him sideways. Please. Mara caught Jonas by the sleeve and pulled him inside. She barred the door against the wind, then handed him a blanket from the peg near the stove. Jonas wrapped it around his shoulders with shaking hands. His boots left wet prints across the floorboards, but he barely noticed. What he noticed was the warmth. Not the blast of a roaring fire. Not smoke-thick heat trapped near the ceiling. Steady warmth. The kind that sat low in the room where people actually lived. He looked down. The boards beneath his boots were dry. Not rind with frost. Not stiff with cold. He slowly bent and touched them with one hand. They're not freezing, he murmured. Mara added a small stick to the stove. They're separated from the ground below. Jonas looked up. We've had fire all day, and fed half your woodpile to the crawl space. He grimaced because he knew she was right. Our children can't sleep, he said quietly. The cold comes through the beds, through the chairs, through everything. Mara studied him. How many in your house? 6. How many houses failing? Jonas hesitated. Most of them. She nodded once, already deciding. Get the oldest and the youngest first. Jonas blinked. What? My cabin will hold more than one family if people stop pretending they need pride. He stared at her, then gave a short, exhausted laugh. You waited a long time to say that. I didn't need to say it before tonight. She opened the door. The storm struck hard. Jonas pulled the blanket tighter and ran back into the white. Mara moved quickly. She rolled up rugs to make space, shifted the table against the wall, set kettles of water near the stove, pulled extra blankets from a chest. Then she crouched and lifted one floorboard near the hearth. Warmth rose gently from the cavity below. The bark layers were doing exactly what she intended, holding trapped air, slowing loss, keeping the room from bleeding heat downward. She replaced the board and stood. Good, because now the house would be tested. The first arrivals came within 20 minutes. Jonas pushed through the door carrying his youngest daughter, wrapped in quilts. Behind him came an older woman and 2 boys with blue lips and frightened eyes. Boots off, Mara ordered immediately. Wet things by the hearth. Sit low, not close. No one argued. They obeyed the tone of someone who understood the room better than they did. More came after that. A widow from the lower road. A carpenter and his wife. 2 children from the Miller place whose chimney had failed. The cabin filled fast. Shoulder to shoulder. Blankets draped over knees. Steam rising from drying coats. And still, the room held. The stove never needed roaring heat because the warmth stayed where it belonged. The insulated floor kept the cold from pooling low, so people did not lose heat through their feet and legs as quickly. Even Jonas noticed. We need twice the fire for this many at my place, he said. 3 times, Mara replied. He didn't argue. Outside, the blizzard screamed through the ridged pines. Inside, children slept sitting upright against their mothers. Men who once laughed at bark now stood barefoot in their stockings, savoring the plain mercy of a floor that did not bite. Around dawn, the worst wind passed. Snow still fell, but softly now. Mara opened the shutter and looked toward the valley. White drifts covered fences and swallowed wagon tracks whole. Several chimneys stood crooked. One roof had collapsed entirely. No one in her cabin spoke for a long moment. Then Jonas said, "We would have lost people." Mara didn't answer. They all knew it. By noon, the storm ended. Men went back down in groups to dig out houses and check neighbors. They returned with tools, salvaged food, and stories of frozen water pails, split boards, and bedrooms colder than barns. Every story ended the same way. The four had turned against them first. That afternoon, Jonas knelt beside Mara as she lifted another plank to show the layers beneath. Sheets of birch bark, overlapping like shingles. Dry straw pockets. Play-sealed seams near the joists. He touched it carefully. "This saved all of us." "No," Mara said. "Understanding did. This is only bark." He sat back on his heels. "Why didn't anyone know?" "Because people copy what they were given," she said. "Few ask if it was right." Word spread faster than the storm ever had. Within days, men came carrying pry bars and sacks. Women came with bundles of collected bark. Children dragged straw and twine bundles twice their size. The valley became a workshop. Floors were lifted, joists inspected, crawl spaces sealed from drafts. Birch bark laid in careful, overlapping layers under Mara's direction. At first, some tried shortcuts. One layer only. Wet bark thrown in loose. Gaps ignored. She sent them home to do it again. By the second week, every house on the ridge road had begun the work. By month's end, the valley looked unchanged from outside. Same cabins, same smoke, same fences. But beneath the planks, everything was different. That was how real progress often looked. Invisible. When the next cold front arrived, families noticed it immediately. Fires lasted longer. Rooms stayed even. Children could stand barefoot long enough to dress. Old men stopped complaining their bones hurt most at dawn. Jonas climbed the ridge carrying 2 fresh-cut birch bundles. "For repairs," he said awkwardly. "You installed yours wrong?" "No." He set the bundles down. "I just figured you'd need more." "And thank you." Mara studied him a moment, then nodded toward the woodpile. "Stack them there." He did. Before leaving, he paused at the door. "I told everyone you were crazy." "I know. I told them bark belongs in the stove." She almost smiled. "Sometimes it still does." He laughed, genuinely this time, and stepped back into the snow. By late winter, the valley had a new saying. If something looked foolish but worked, people called it Mara wise. She disliked the phrase, but she kept it to herself. Spring came slowly. Snow retreated from the fields. Water ran under fences again. And in cabins across the valley, families walked their floors in bare feet, remembering the night laughter nearly froze them. Because they had learned what storms teach better than pride ever can. The smartest fix is often hidden under your feet, until the blizzard arrives.